discussions we're having about, extinction, I think is over sensationalizing. I don't think we're going to extinction because of generative AI. We're going to dance with AI, but the question of who's going to lead that dance is still unanswered. One way to outsmart AI or to outmaneuver AI is to start to learn faster from each other. Heck, if we can increase human comprehension to 80%, if 80% of what I was seeing and thinking in my head could be transferred to everyone in this audience right now, we might go supersonic.
So you spoke about being anchored in your roots so that you can weather the storm. And I think especially in the US, while it is the land of opportunity, it is the land of rejection as well, I think.
Some people do it for the fame. Some people do it for the fortune. Some people just do it because they don't know another way. I'm in that third category.
Good day, everybody. Today, our guest, Richie Etwaru, is a distinguished innovator, an author of 3 books, a TEDx speaker, a co-founder of Mobeus, and we'll learn more about what that company does and the problems that they're solving. His groundbreaking work in immersive AI, we'll learn a lot about immersive AI today, has revolutionized human-machine interaction with numerous patents and extensive work experience at the leadership level of different Fortune 500 organizations and government agencies. Richie is that pioneer in immersive AI, privacy, healthcare, and financial services, and his ongoing efforts to shape the future of technology, driving growth and innovation across multiple sectors definitely expands a lot of the impact that he can have on different people's lives. So really grateful to have you as our first guest from Guyana today. Shout out.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me to the show and to the audience. As you know, when you and I met in Jamaica, I told you while I live in the US, when you leave the Caribbean never leaves you. And so I'm always very excited to have conversations back with members of the diaspora as well as folks back across the Caribbean. I've done some work in Guyana, but as you've seen, I've done work in Jamaica and in St. Lucia and some of the other islands. Once you get to my age, the land comes calling you back.
Yes, and the land needs you, most definitely. I think one of the main reasons I do the podcast is I really feel for the young people at home who have not gotten to go abroad to get the opportunities that we have, and anything that we can do to give back is much appreciated.
Well, that's getting much better. I mean, that's getting a little bit better. When I was young and back home in the Caribbean, we didn't have an internet connection, that I've heard about a computer in the country, right? So now there is actually tools to work with. What's missing is the knowledge and the conversation, So let's continue to do this. And thank you for doing this. I think it's super important that folks like yourself bring the conversation together as well.
Most certainly, and I'm very excited about Guyana. Everyone's really talking about the oil and all of those things. And as I reflect a lot on how Trinidad has approached the gifts that they were given, let's say I really hope to see Guyana even learn from the lessons that the mistakes that Trinidad has made, and hopefully they go forth and really expand the region like nothing that we've ever seen before.
Yeah, me too.
Perfect. So we're in the age of generative AI, but talk to us about immersive AI.
Yeah, fantastic. And, immersive AI is something that we have been calling it for a while. It's just become in vogue lately because I think everyone else has been woken up to sort of this construct of artificial intelligence and the art of the possible of what it can do. Immersive itself is based on a simple thesis, which is that we have to be able to transfer more between each other. Meaning we've got to be able to communicate more effectively, comprehend more effectively, retain more effectively, and reuse more effectively. And we're talking about sort of a human connection, the ability to connect from one human to another. If you think about human connection, at one point we started grunting at each other, right? If you leave religion out of the conversation temporarily and respectfully, at one point we were just grunting at each other. So the aperture of what we can transfer between each other was very narrow, right? Human comprehension between each other was very low. Today, arguably, we transfer about 5% of what you imagine and what you're saying to me and what I'm imagining and trying to say to this audience. Only about 5% is being transferred.
Hmm.
Immersive AI uses machine learning, computer vision, and principles of the natural user interface to help us transfer more between each other as we communicate on these screens. So I'm sure, obviously, Mark, you saw the demo at Tech Beach in Jamaica, and there are various videos of the demonstrations of our immersive AI technology on the internet now. What it essentially does is it turns the screens and cameras that we have today, so commodity desktop, commodity Mac, commodity camera, into an immersive and interactive experience where your hands can start to engage with the objects on the screen. You can look around and look into things, get that VR, AR experience without having to put on the headset or additional hardware. And so it feels like Minority Report on the outside and the metaverse on the
Mm-hmm.
inside, slightly futuristic, kind of Tom Cruise-ish, Iron Man-ish. But if you think about simple things like education, right? How could we learn faster if we can actually transfer more between each other? If you think about business communication, how can you build a more comprehensive, engaging discussion with your clients if you can now transfer more over the screen? So the machine learning part is really around understanding human intention, right? Humans viewing intention. Where is the person looking from what angle into a virtual world? And then humans' interactive intention. If I put my hand on the corner of the screen and swipe it, it should change the slide if I'm doing a slide presentation, right?
Yes.
So it's that ability to be able to what we call double human comprehension. Our purpose at Mobeus is to double human comprehension. We think, we can do it in about 20, 30 years. And before generative, and this is really, really interesting, before generative, we were doing it as a nice to have, right? Like
Okay.
it's nice to be able to communicate more. It's nice to be able to engage more. When generative showed up, while generative is artificial, the threat to continued human triumph is genuine. Like some of the discussions we're having about, extinction, I think is over sensationalizing. I don't think we're going to extinction because of generative AI. We're going to dance with AI, but the question of who's going to lead that dance is still unanswered. And so if you think about, well, how do we outsmart artificial intelligence? In order to outsmart artificial intelligence, you got to outlearn it. And machine learning is fast. That's an exponential game. We are linear human beings. So what we see at Mobeus today is suddenly we see our purpose actually having more impact and more relevance, because one way to outsmart AI or to outmaneuver AI is to start to learn faster from each other, to communicate more. If we can double comprehension from 5 to 10, we might be able to fend off the exponential nature of AI. Heck, if we can increase human comprehension to 80%, if 80% of what I was seeing and thinking in my head could be transferred to everyone in this audience right now, we might go supersonic, right?
Yes.
So that's the path that we're on. That's where we use the technology. That's where we anchor. That's our core. We want to be able to use technology to get as close as possible as we can get to telepathy.
What encouraged you all to pursue this idea? That's a very interesting. Yeah. How did that begin?
So it began a couple of weeks into COVID. And
Mm.
so I was running a privacy company with the thesis that privacy should become a human right. Meaning, if you take the 30 human rights that we have today and you look at them, you realize that they cover the really, really important things of the past, right? We need a right to freedom, right to vote, all that type of stuff. But it doesn't cover some of the things that were coming in the future. And one of the things that is still coming in the future is that we don't have a good way to contract at global institutional scale our data between consumers and corporations. And so I had co-founded a company called humanity.co, like the company for humanity. with
Yes.
the thesis that we should add a 31st human right that would classify human data as human property. And as a
Hmm.
result, given that most countries have property law already, and we understand how to lease property, transfer property, pay for property, pay taxes on property, that human data could be traded on top of property law between consumers and corporations for a higher level of intentional consent so that we can really get this data conversation clear and concise. We were doing very well. We started in the healthcare vertical because healthcare data is obviously the one that needs the most consent and can benefit humanity the most. In the process of closing a Series A, had a term sheet semi-negotiated, COVID hit, lockdown, and that company could not continue to survive. So
Wow.
as I was thinking about what do I want to do next, I had two choices. I could go back to the enterprise, which I absolutely plan to do. I enjoy working in large enterprises. It's a
Okay.
lot of fun, and startups are a grind. Um, but I figured let me do a second startup because COVID is big. We're talking about a massive restructuring of society, right? I figured if this thing lasts 1 year, even at 1 year, it would be the most disruptive experience all humans have shared, right?
Yes.
Even if you compare it to world wars, right? Or, Michael Jackson dying, right? Like this is shared across all ages, all cultures for a prolonged period of time. I envisioned that there would be drastic change. And the thing that I thought was non negotiable was that remote is going to matter more. And so we started solving for if people are not going to be present, they're not going to have real presence, how can we improve what telepresence is, right? And if you look at Zoom and Teams and everything else, while they do a great job today, what we don't realize is that they were not designed for the level of consumption that we're using them today,
Hmm.
right? This generation of tools was meant to be used 1 or 2 hours a day, right? If you couldn't make a meeting, right, or you were running late, it was never meant to be used 8 hours a day for all of your communication, both professional and private. And so I saw that thesis that we're going to have to be able to transfer more. Was able to get I put some seed capital in. We saw a couple of breakthroughs, got a co founder, raised more capital. About a year in, we got to some significant breakthroughs. About a year and a half in, we started to get the perception of depth to work, the programmable interactive perception of depth on the screens that we have today. About 2 years in was when we first realized that, wow, if we can scale this, if we can mature this, we can really double human comprehension. And that tied in perfectly to sort of this idea that we're going to have to be able to transfer more. Now that we have it working, generative shows up. Suddenly we're like, it's needed a lot more now than it was needed last year.
I see. I have a very interesting experience. So I've been working at a video for 2 years, and I started almost during the when the pandemic started, or during the pandemic, and I met my boss for the first time after 2 years. So I'd been watching him on a screen for 2 years in this flat 2D. And when I saw him in person and I heard his voice, all my senses were confused because I was like, is this the real person? What's really happening? And um, can you talk about what's happening to us psychologically and biologically by now interpreting a human interaction as this flat 2D space? Even as I'm staring at you right now, there's no depth information that I'm really consuming in my mind. What do you think is
Right.
the sort of long term impact? Let's say if Mobeus did not exist to really bring that immersiveness there.
Well, I think you're keying in on the key component of where we differentiate. And I want to talk to you a little bit about where we differentiate. Just on NVIDIA, we just got accepted to the NVIDIA Inception program for startups.
Nice.
So we're very excited about that. Obviously, it gives us access to all of NVIDIA's sort of AI capabilities, cloud processing, and GPU technology. So we're super excited about that. So we're going to be partners soon enough here.
It's gonna be good.
Um, so in order to transcend the communication systems that we have today, we had to go back and study the art and the science of real communication in real life, so real presence, and then telepresence. Okay, so I'll give you a simple example of one of these things. So what we found with the current generation technology, which impacts how you feel about a person, is that the current generation technology forces you to either stare at the camera or turn off the camera. Because while you're on
Hmm.
camera right now, if you're not
Yeah.
staring at the camera, you might think that I'm not paying attention,
Yes.
right? Whereas if you and I were in the same room and I just decided to look outside and admire, the trees or the weather or the sun right now, if you were sitting right across from me, you wouldn't think that I'm not paying attention because you
Right.
know that I'm here, I'm in front of you, I'm listening, I can hear you. I just happen to look outside because it's a beautiful day,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this sort of unwritten rule that if thou are not looking right into the camera, thou are not paying attention, it adds a whole new layer of background processing in a system where we don't have anything to give. We're barely getting 5% across from each other, much less me having to actively and cognitively remember to look at that camera just to make sure that I can prove attention,
Yes.
right?
Ooh, prove
So,
attention.
so what we found was that people were doing this. They would minimize the meetings, and you must have seen this before. They would minimize the meetings and then start to do this, which is they're typing on their app like crazy, but trying to look like you're still looking at the camera while the meeting is completely minimized, right?
Hmm.
How many times have you done that? And
Yes.
so these new experiences are really reshaping the way we connect with each other. Now, we solved for this in the Airglass by allowing you to mix content, your desktop, and your meeting at the same time. So we have a product called Airglass. And what Airglass does is it puts the video behind the desktop. We use the perception of depth to put the video behind the desktop. We make the desktop transparent and adjustable. So you could be in Slack, looking through Slack and seeing the meeting behind there and working in Slack and looking at the person at the same time. Essentially, to be able to work and meet at the same time. And what that does is it reduces this expectation that you should be looking at the camera, because when you're on Airglass, everybody knows that you can look through your desktop and see the meeting behind there, right?
Right.
And if you haven't seen it, you know, join the beta. We'll put an Airglass on your machine. You'll see that you can work and meet at the same time. These are the types of things that are affecting the way we start to connect with each other. I'm not surprised that the first time you met your boss, it felt like a whole different experience after engaging with them, for almost 2 years. So the study of this art and science of what's actually happening in this tele everything world is where we are actually competing, right? We've put the Airglass in front of a lot of people. You know, I had a college professor say to me, what you don't realize is that there is a benefit here to being able to see the meeting and the content at the same time, which is I can now point at the content. So when you screen share, we
Mm-hmm.
screen share your desktop to everyone. Now, because I'm behind the screen share, I can point at the various boxes on the screen or the things that I want you to look at. And he said, I've never had this in the classroom, because whenever I was in the classroom and I had to, teach, I would go to the
Turn
blackboard and
around.
teach. And
Yeah.
students
Yeah.
would be looking at my shoulder. But here now, I can actually point at this stuff. So it's in these very delicate but extremely important nuances of communication that we're studying and arcing this technology to a place where we can double human comprehension. And we've set a goal for ourselves of about 30 years to be able to achieve this. Before generative, I think society thought we had a couple of 100 years before this
Right.
would happen. I think right now we have to outlearn the machines. And in order to outlearn the machines, we've got to get there. But you've keyed in on a very key point here. This is very different. And if you do it for a long term, period of time, when you do get into the real world like you did, you can see the stark difference between the aperture of what can be communicated.
This to some degree would change a lot of lecturing, because as your professor pointed out, the entire history of lecturing has been a person at the front. You're watching the person, you're watching the content, they're pointing, they're writing, you're looking at their back. So you're almost trained to wait for a teacher to write. And now we switched over to PowerPoint where the text is there. So I'm watching the text, but I'm seeing this person's face on the right hand side or the left hand side. And I'm like, you're crossing both, reading the text, mapping the text, watching their intuition, and now you're layering all of that. It'll be very interesting to see how the brain starts to adapt to that as a new form of normality.
Yeah, it takes a couple of minutes to kind of get accustomed to the fact that you're seeing two things at the same time. If you wanted, and we didn't talk about this, if you wanted, I could screen share. I don't know if the screen share will be recorded. I could show it to you live. So like what it feels like. It takes a little bit to get accustomed to it, but it's no different than looking through a transparent screen that is displaying content than somebody being behind there, right?
Yes.
It's no different from that. So those are some of the things that we're working on. We've added this ability to draw over anything in our software. So no matter what you are working on, whether you're working on a website, on Miro, on Mural, on Monday.com, on a PowerPoint, on Excel, in Salesforce, very quickly you pick up our pen and you can draw over anything displayed on the screen, right? Most applications out there give you a whiteboard, but that whiteboard is confined in that application. You can't draw over anything else. And this was a pretty difficult piece to engineer, actually, to be able to draw over anything. And the reason why we did that is as we looked at real presence versus telepresence, one of the things in real presence is humans have this innate, almost pre-programmed desire to grab a pen and draw.
Okay.
To grab a pen and draw. And I think it was IDEO that did this study where in their sort of lobby area at IDEO, they had this big table that was all big pieces of paper that you could pull off and just markers on there. And inevitably, anyone who sat down, within a matter of a couple of minutes, picked up the markers and started drawing. How many times have you been in a conference room where you're like, hey, it works like this, and you just pick up a marker and you start drawing on a whiteboard, or you bring a piece of paper in the office and you start to draw? These tools don't allow you to do that with that ease, with that efficiency, with that sort of expectation that it's okay. Right now, most of these tools, hold on, let me go to the whiteboard. Can you see the whiteboard? No, can you see the whiteboard? Well, no, I can't see the whiteboard. Can you see it? And then, oh, only you can draw? Wait, I can't draw? How can I draw? Oh, my drawing is not working. We built this thing called a light board, which is in the Airglass. When you turn it on, the ink is there. Anybody can draw all at the same time across the entire connection. So it's stuff like this that I know it sounds audacious, Mark, like you're going to double human comprehension. It's not impossible. It's improbable if you don't give it enough time. But we have been advancing our ability to comprehend more between each other for the last couple of 100 years. Language is only a couple of 100 years old.
Yes. Why is this problem hard? That's a oversimplified question, but I think the audience needs to understand why this is a difficult problem to solve.
Well, the difficulty is in three dimensions. First is that we are not a unified species, right?
Okay.
We've got a lot of personalization with each other. Everything from someone's neurodiversity, right? Someone's level of charisma and communication skills, someone's language ability, someone's comfort presenting. I once read a stat, and I think Jerry Seinfeld did a really good episode on this. That when you list people's fear, what the top fear is public speaking, and then the second one is death. So if you're at a funeral, the person who's doing the eulogy is way more scared than the person that's in the casket, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a very variable sort of set of characteristics as humans. And so you've got to study a broad swath of things to be able to understand what's that one thing that could apply to the broadest
Everybody.
set of
Mm-hmm.
humans, right? That's number one. Number two is you're dealing with change, and you're dealing with change on a fundamental level. Look, we've built an amazingly better tool, but for as many times as we get people who say, yeah, this is better, we also get people that says, yeah, but can it work like Zoom and Teams?
Hmm.
Right? Because while it is different, there's some people like, yeah, but I kind of like the fact that when I enter the room, I'm muted automatically. And we're like, huh, okay, seriously, we didn't think that made sense. Like, why would you mute everybody when they enter the room? They're coming here to talk, right?
Yes.
So it's a change problem. It takes time, right? It's going to take time for us to all recognize that part of what is happening here with this loss of real presence is we're going to damage mental health. This stuff takes a toll, right? This unspoken, unfelt frustration of not being able to express oneself to one's own belief of their capability has an impact over long-term mental health. So one is just how broad it is. Two is change, and then three is technologically. These systems are not set up for this. If you think about what you saw us doing, where we're mixing presence and content in a virtual world with digital twins, right? If it was not for GPUs, we would not be able to do that. The CPUs just can't handle that type of processing, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the hard work we've had to do here is to take things that were written for CPUs and then hammer them down and then transfer them to the GPU to be able to run that type of processing. So there's a bit of step change that still has to happen with the chips and the sensors. Most of the cameras that we use in our technology works on the regular CMOS sensors that are standardized that everybody has today. But the sensing technology is improving, not just with things like LiDAR, but if you think about, you know, like narrow band perovskite photo detectors. This is a whole new different type of metal category that's not even based on silica and silicone that can
Mm-hmm.
capture R, G, and B separately as separate spectrums. So you don't need filters to be able to do that. When we get to those types of cameras, right, we're going to gather the type of intelligence with computer vision where you might see my thoughts floating around my head as I'm talking to you because it could be extracted from my face, from the squint of my eye. It's telling you something. And so I think that's where technology is hard, which is how are we going to capture that and visualize it in such a way so that it can be retained? Because retention is pretty low. Forget comprehension, right? So I may understand 5% of what you're saying, Mark, but I'm only
Just like.
remembering half of that, right? Much
Mm-hmm.
less being able to reuse it. So how do we outlearn machine learning? That's what we're after, right? We've got to be able to communicate more, comprehend more, retain more, and then reuse more.
Wow. What's your take on the advancements of cameras? So a lot of the laptops are having much better cameras now. What's your prediction on when really powerful cameras come about where you can do a lot more immersive stuff that you're really hoping for? Is that a
Yeah.
5-year thing, a 10-year thing?
Well, we get a lot out of the cameras that are there today, thanks to computer vision and some of the sort of open source machine learning models. Models such as sign language are very mature, right?
Okay.
Some of the face mesh models are very mature already. Um, I think adding LiDAR is amazing. When we add LiDAR to our
Hmm.
immersive AI technology, you can pick up a ball and throw it across the screen, and someone can kind of pick it up on the other side with their hands. But I believe cameras will have to go through a step change, right? And I think at the sensor, as I mentioned, the sensor technology that we're using here is over 50 years old, right? It's the same RGB. You can only go so far with megapixels before you need a step change in what the actual ability to capture the light and to break up red, greens, and blues into their spectrum to be able to gather that intelligence at massive levels. The other is multi-camera systems, right? So, adding a second camera is a step change by itself, right? So right now we have sort of this very archaic experience, which is, I've got thousands of pixels on the screen and one camera. And by the way, the camera's off to the top. So if I actually look at you, it looks like I'm looking down on the screen. So I have to keep looking up there. I see a world where there's a hybrid material where pixels and cameras are mixed in together so that the entire screen is sort of this sensory sort of medium that we can engage with. Imagine if every 8 pixels there was a little camera, every 8 pixels there was a little camera in the entire screen. Think about the presence of such a virtual material. What does that do? I could look around your room in real time, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And you think that's a 5 year away, 10 years? It's I think it's close. At least, yeah.
So it's within the decade.
Okay.
But the future is already here. It's just not distributed evenly. I think that's George Bernard Shaw, if I'm not mistaken, right? So the question is, when will it get to consumer grade, devices? And right now, most of the hardware manufacturers are, I think, on a sort of a misguided path. This idea of sort of, putting on glasses or putting on headsets or putting on AR, VR glasses, I just don't think this is the future. I don't see it as the path, simply because it's not sustainable for a prolonged period of time, right? Whereas the relationship with the screen, you can stand in front of a screen, leave a little space for life, engage, look around a little, still have your freedoms, right? I think that there is going to be manufacturers that are going to start to focus on transitioning this screen camera combination. And I think that's where the beauty comes to life.
Exciting.
It's within the decade.
Within the decade. And I imagine hopefully meetings will get maybe a lot more interesting, where you're not just stuck in position and your head is fixed like this. And we could look out the window and kind of relax and not have our boss maybe look at us like we're wasting their time or wasting their money.
Yeah, I think part of that is just adjustment, right? I see this battle between employers and employees, and there's this sort of tension in work culture today. Both sides are coping. As much as employees are, feel like I'm ahead and I know how to engage, HR organizations, security and infrastructure organizations are struggling, right? If you think about cyber threat today and what institutions and large organizations and governments have to do to lock down these work devices that has to be in people's homes, just so that they don't have massive security breaches, it's almost like anti-productivity, right? Because the machine is so locked down, you can't install anything on it. You can't browse any website to be able to be inquisitive or to learn or to be inspired, right? So there's a lot of tension there, and all of us are struggling on all sides. I certainly think we'll get to a world where you can, look away and people understand that you're still paying attention. But what's going to be more important is the dynamicism of the actual experience. And here's what I mean by that. One of the things we're working on here at Mobeus is we want to figure out, how do we arrange people, places, and things into unique, familiar experiences? So let me unpack that for a second. Right now, we're using an equivalent of, this is a version of WebEx, right?
Yes.
All of these things are a version of WebEx. Okay, we're using a version of WebEx. This is Zoom, Teams. I'm sorry, it's all just a version of WebEx, right?
Yep.
We're using a version of WebEx that is based on rectangles and buttons, right? And that may work for this context because this is a show, and so we're kind of like on television, square heads right on the screen. That works. But we're also forced to use this for kindergarten remote learning. Okay? And if you think about a kindergarten class inside, there's lots of bright primary colors on the walls. There's charts, there's the ABCs, there's the multiplication tables. There are pictures of different trees and animals. And all of that is an important part of that experience that we just
Mm-hmm.
don't have here. And so the importance of bringing depth into communication, as you saw our Airglass 3D technology, allows you to meet in a virtual world and experience this connection and perception of depth in it, is that now you can place these familiar objects, these familiar stimuli. The place has to matter, the things that are in there has to matter, and then the people arrangement has to matter. You wouldn't arrange a preschool classroom like this. You'd have a circular environment because kids sit in circles in preschool, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what will help us kind of get to a state of norm and acceptance is when the context of the meeting is personalized. If you're going into a remote birthday party, you want that room to be set up completely differently from this room. And then the behaviors are different, right? The level of relaxation and comfort or the level of alertness is completely different. This works great for a courtroom as well, right? Like if you're doing
Mm.
remote court, this is amazing. This design pattern works, but it doesn't work for virtual worship, right? And so all of these things are still in front of us. We've got a long runway. Collaboration is a big market.
Whew. I wanted to share something that I experienced with this whole ChatGPT thing. So I was using 3.5 and it was fast, and I started using 4. I was like, okay, I'm only using 4, but 4 is slower just because it's way bigger. So I got accustomed to the speed of 4, and I went back to try 3.5, and they had done some speed ups, and it's just spitting out the answers instantly. I'm like, this can't be correct. It makes no sense. It can't give me the answer that fast, and that has no true bearing in the actuality of how correct the answer is. It's just I've been trained to think that this is the speed of really well thought out AI responses versus it actually knowing how to do it a lot faster. So I can imagine what people are experiencing when they're seeing this new experience, and they're like, it is jarring to remove that anchor from your mind to move forward with technology. So
Yeah, so with the large language models, I think first of all, I think um, generative is not a chip problem; it's a data problem.
hmm.
And chips are going to open the door, but data is what's going to start the party in the room. And there's going to be a certain amount of value that we can extract from what is open data, right? But if you think about closed data, if you think about research data in the pharmaceutical industry, which is hard to share because there are competitive moats between different companies and
Mm-hmm.
intellectual property stuff like that. It's not standardized. It's not all textual. So a lot of it is images and media, right? We still got a lot of ways to go there, but I think we ought to be semi sober about the over essentialization of AI as well. Um, and to do that, I don't think that we should mix performance with competence, right?
Okay.
So when I say performance, I mean the speed of what sort of a large language model can kick out. Look, if you typed your question into that large language model and it took 3 days to come back with the response, you wouldn't think it's that smart, right?
Hmm.
You just wouldn't think it's that smart because you took 3 days to figure that out. Come on, I could have written that in 30 minutes. So there's a performance aspect to it. And humans by nature, when we see performance, we assume further competence, right? So when you see the answer comes back very quickly, you're like, well, if it knows how to do that, it probably knows how to do all these other 8,000 things.
Hmm.
And the answer is not really. Because if you were to press ChatGPT on certain things that it came back with and said, I appreciate what you said there. That's fantastic. But do you think that I can eat that sentence? Doesn't really understand that. Or you say, can you apply a lens of fairness to these two arguments? Can't really do that, right?
Yeah.
So we have to understand that there is performance that we're getting from the technology, but let's not extrapolate competency, right? Competency will be built based on the data sets that we put into the models. That's not to say that the threat of AI is not artificial. The threat of AI is genuine. It's genuine uncertainty. And I go back to where we sort of started this segment of the conversation. In order to transcend this uncertainty of machine learning, which learns so fast, we as a human species has to become a learning species. And we learn right now through tradition and pedagogy, right? So you learn from your parents and your neighbors and your society by tradition, right? And then you learn through school, right? Some of us still learn in the post academic world, but for the most part, not a lot of it happens, right? You could argue that from a learning perspective, we're like learning dinosaurs, right? We just don't learn that fast. It takes us generations to learn and adapt new things. We've got to be able to learn a lot faster. That's the evolutionary benchmark that I think we've got to be able to latch onto as we deal with this sort of genuine body of uncertainty around, who's going to lead that dance between humans and artificial intelligence.
I like the thread that you're on. Talk to me about what do you think is going to happen to students in school now? So the kids that are in kindergarten and they're coming through the system, they're coming into a traditional school system where I won't say teachers were replaced, where teachers will be replaced, but teachers will be augmented. Let's go with that train of thought. But what are you seeing for the future of education? It's very complex and scary to some degree.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that what the young people are going through right now, what our young people are going through right now, we've gone through before. Okay.
Okay.
If you go back to Peter Drucker's theory of manual workers are going to become knowledge workers, right? Where the motor was introduced that would insanely automate manual labor, right? And the PC was introduced, which would insanely automate information sharing. You can see how we went from manual workers to knowledge workers. And my grandparents were manual workers. I remember my grandfather saying to me, my nana saying to me, you need to learn a trade, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like welding or carpentry. And me thinking, no, man, I'm going to school for computer science, right? So they were knowledge workers and I became, they were manual workers and I became a knowledge worker, right? But there's my parents in between there who were caught between like, am I a manual worker? Am I a knowledge worker? There was one generation, which is my parents, that was kind of caught between, the construction work boots, right? And the business shoe, so to speak, right? So it took about 100 years for us to go through that transition. I see the Goldilocks conditions for a same transition happening. Generative is consuming knowledge work. And I see immersive as opening up the aperture for what I call visionary workers, where you're not trading in information, but you're trading in imagination, where you're able to kind of have an interconnected imagination network where I can transfer for you my ideas faster, where the art of the day is not productivity but creativity. And so I think our species is going through the same thing. We went from manual workers to knowledge workers. Now I'm no Peter Drucker, so I'm just stealing a method, right?
Sure.
We're going to go from knowledge workers to visionary workers, where creativity is the superpower. And so I think from an education standpoint, rote memory is probably going to have to reduce a little bit, and we're going to have to introduce creativity a little bit more. STEM was fantastic for knowledge work, but what's the equivalent of STEM for visionary work? And I think one of the fundamental
Hmm.
premises of that is more collaboration, more group projects, more teaming, more exchange of ideas, more exchange of imagination. That's where our youth has to get to. What does concern me? So while this has happened before, and so we can all rest a little and go, okay, I get it. This is just happening again, right? We're just feeling the nervousness that our parents or grandparents felt, right, when we were going through the last version of it. What I think bothers me a little bit and keeps me up a little bit at night, I'm a dad, we've got two young boys, my wife and I, is the pace of change.
Mm-hmm.
We're dealing with an exponential threat. We have not had to deal with exponential threats before. This is not linear. We don't have 2 or 3 generations to get past this. At best, we got about 30 years. And so that's why I'm still very passionate about the work that we're doing at Mobeus, because we believe, and there are going to be many other things we have to do. Look, in order to transcend this sort of genuine uncertainty around AI, we not only have to communicate, comprehend, retain, and reuse more, we got to get better at mental health. We got to eat better.
Mm-hmm.
We may have to exercise and sleep more. This is a mental game now, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
we also have another deficit, just for me to raise the topic, if I may. We have another deficit that we're dealing with, which is the last 20 years, our communication pipes have been rusted. Okay.
Hmm.
With
Okay.
the
Okay.
introduction of social media, we narrowed the aperture of what can communicate. We shortened our attention span insanely with social media. It's almost like when your arteries get built up with what is it called? My
The plaque
language
and stuff
set
like that.
doesn't
Yeah. Yeah.
plaque. Yes, right. Like we narrowed that communication pipe down to short 6 seconds videos. And not only did we narrow the pipe of communication, we started to put junk through it,
Hmm.
right? With the democratization of media. And so we got a little, cleaning up to do before we can even wake up to get to where we need to get to compete with artificial forms of intelligences.
Hmm. There was a lot. That was some heavy stuff, and I didn't think I caught on to your importance of learning, increasing the speed of learning, and increasing those 4 facets that you had mentioned until you had just said something there in terms of, and I did share that sentiment silently. Okay, yeah, we went from machines to, from manual work to knowledge work. I think people had time, like you're saying, to make that jump and to study and to learn, and education, all of the institutions had time to standardize as the methods were sort of still in development, and things were slow. But now things are moving so fast. And I like the little extra tidbit that you put in there, that we're being conditioned to not be able to do extremely difficult learning tasks. We're actually being conditioned to be stupider and stupider every day, or have these micro attention spans. So it's an interesting battle that we feel internally and externally in the world. This is a good topic. Hmm.
We're at a massive inflection point. We just had an insane social economic shock called COVID, was just starting to see the byproducts of it. And we have come from, 20 years of binge eating in media, and suddenly we have to become Olympic coordinated swimmers.
I like that analogy a lot. Okay, I wanted to talk about Guyana, and by proxy, sort of the Caribbean. I think as I look at all the Caribbean islands, I hadn't realized how tiny they all are. But now when we include Guyana, Guyana is like a legit solid body of mass. And you did an interview where you highlighted several advantages I think that Guyana had, and some are shared among the other Caribbean islands. One being the Eastern time zone. Two, for Guyana's perspective, it's a 5-hour flight to New York, and you highlighted New York as sort of the center of business, the consistent summer weather, the biodiversity of the nature that's there. That's, I've been a big fan of Guyana for a long time. The ingenuity of the people, meaning um, you all make something out of anything to some degree, and overall the massive physical resources that are there within the country. How do you see Guyana and by extension the Caribbean being positioned as a global workforce of the future?
Well, I think it's the next wave, right? So
Hmm.
so to me, the issue with the Caribbean is a lack of coordinated effort, right?
Hmm.
If you think about the United States, what makes the United States powerful is the uniting of the states. Imagine
Mm-hmm.
if the US was, 50 plus countries that are not coordinated, that are not aligned on a single currency, that are not aligned on an economic thesis, that are not governed by consistent rules of laws, where each country's border, you couldn't transfer a doctor's degree from one border to another. Imagine if we were a bifurcated states. Or think about the European Union and think about the union that had to be formed to compete with the unitedness of America as a superpower over the oceans. The main challenge with the Caribbean, and there's been a lot of progress, by the way, compared to when I lived in the Caribbean 30 years ago to now, is that ability to unite and coordinate. This breaks down to infrastructure, right? It breaks down information systems. Right now, if you're a nurse on one island and you have to go to another island, you probably have to get re-credentialed completely,
Yes.
right? Inter-island trade, shared laws, assistance across different regions when there are catastrophes. There needs to be a heightened form of unitedness, and I think maybe CARICOM needs to be rebranded, not as the Caribbean Community, but as the Caribbean United Forces. Right?
Hmm.
I don't know. Somebody's going to do a better branding job at that, right? Because community is still a little loose. It's a little too loose to be a geographic powerhouse, right? Um, think about the United Emirates, right? It's that's I think one of the first things that are missing. Second, I think is a rule of law, right? One of the things that we lack in the Caribbean is a consistent economic and legal framework in order to advance, you know, theses such as capitalism, right? So if rule of law is not clear and rule of law is not enforced, then markets can't be formed,
Hmm.
right? One of the things that we see in one of the things that we see in the Caribbean is we see, you know, people absconding the law a lot. There's no enforcement of the law. There's this kind of loose behavior, right? And it varies island by island, country by country, right? How do you create the confidence for a large multinational organization to deploy a department and a building and a regional unit in Guyana when after they deploy all the computers overnight, they come back the next morning, people broke in and stole all the computers and nobody can help them,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
Now, that rule of law is not a fault of the people. That's not the issue. It's also not so much the fault of the government, although the government should start to be held more accountable. Remember, we're post colonial,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there
Mm-hmm.
was once a rule of law that was in another motherland or fatherland. We never really had to set up universities that taught gubernatorial law, universities that taught parliamentarian practices, right? We didn't have a university that trained enough lawyers to be able to institute and install our own government, our own systems, and our own rule of laws. It takes about 100 years after the colonials, after Great Britain and France and Spain after the European colonists kind of extract themselves, and guess what? They just get up and fly out one day. For you to set up government, law, police, taxation, all of those things, there's like 100-year hangover period before you can
Mm.
start to get it right. Right. So that's why I feel like the time is coming now. I'm seeing more uniting. I'm seeing more catching up to the G20, right? I'm being invited to speak in the Caribbean way more than I'm being invited to speak in Europe because the
Hmm.
Caribbean is suddenly thirsty for thought leadership and for futurism. Um, and I also see, a lot more upgrades in legal frameworks. Jamaica has a stock market, right?
Yeah.
There are now patent laws being lifted up in different members of CARICOM. So I think that we're just on the precipice of becoming sort of a regional superpower, so to speak. But I think that unitedness is what is missing. That's the piece that I think has to come together. I'd love to see somebody pull South America and the Caribbean together, right?
Hmm.
If you bring in Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, all of that together, that's when we can really coordinate and trade sort of intercontinental, quarter horsepower coordinated together.
Great. One of the things I like to do with this show, actually, my main audience that I speak to and I hope to impact is the young person who is in a financially challenged position within a family who is not exposed to the technological advancements that are sort of available in the world. What would you say to that young person? And I focus on young people just because I feel as if the elder folks are in the system, they're already making money, they have a path to navigate the financial system. What do you think they can do to overcome the barriers to progress? There's always race, politics, the standard thing across all of the different islands within the Caribbean. What can the individual do to overcome some of those uncontrollable factors?
Well, I think there are different areas that we can look and learn from.
Okay.
The Caribbean is not the only region in the world that has youth that, as we say in Guyana, you can't catch a break, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, if you think about parts of the African subcontinent, parts of Asia, parts of India, even parts of South America, there are some parts of the Middle East, right? Every region in the world has a group of people who can't catch a break. But within the last sort of 20 to 30 years, technology has been this kind of bullet train that you can jump on and kind
Mm-hmm.
of take off. And so the first thing I would say is to be insanely curious about technology. And that curiosity doesn't have to come from, you know, going to South by Southwest or being in the middle of the Webit conference. A lot of this content is available on blogs, on videos, and very, very, very simple things like that. And if you don't have a computer, you can consume it over a mobile device. If you don't have a computer or a mobile device, find a friend that has one, ask them for an hour, work hard, pay for the internet for an hour, and just be very, very curious about technology. Technology is moving so fast that there's always opportunity in it,
Mm-hmm.
always opportunity. It's not something that is moving as slow as, like, the steel industry, where once you learned everything, the people who learned are the ones that control it because nothing else will change. And so there's no chance for somebody else to come in, right?
Yes.
I've been riding this technological journey my entire career. I'm more of a journeyman in this than anything else. I don't get too lost and caught in the ebb and flow of the next shiny object or the thing that failed, right? This is a journey, it's an evolutionary journey. Be curious about technology simply because technology changes so fast that the David and Goliath story plays out over and over and over and over. And it plays out in technology a lot more than it plays out in other things that have come to our species. So that's my first thing. Be very curious about technology. The David and Goliath scenario plays out there a lot more than in other situations. The other is what I call anti-fragility. So, there's a lot of talk on resilience, and I've worked on my resilience a lot over the years. Think about coming from Guyana, migrating here. I grew up in South Jamaica, Queens. I went to, CUNY, which is not the best universities in the world, still a good school, not to knock the school that I went to. Working construction, trying to get a job on Wall Street. First time I had to raise capital for a licensed monitor, I was 23. Think about that. A Guyanese guy grew up in Queens trying to raise VC capital on an idea to monitor driver's license on behalf of trucking companies, right? I've been told no 1,000 times more than I've been told yes. And you got to build resilience. And after a while, the resilience breaks you down. After a while, it could break you. Okay, so a lot of no's, a lot of hurdles, a lot of failures, a lot of mistakes can break you. You have to become anti-fragile. You got to believe that your roots are so deep and it powers your ambition and your commitment so strongly that nothing is going to break you. Because regardless of what part of the world you're in, Guyana or aspects of China or in the bottom of the African subcontinent somewhere, even if you had resources put in front of you and you could exercise your curiosity, this road ahead is full of blocks. It's full of hurdles. It's full of roadblocks. And if you don't have that anti-fragility where your roots are powering an ambition to forge forward, I give you all the resources in the world. You're still not going to make it because you're going to quit halfway.
Ooh, that's deep. Why did you say curious? And I'm very curious as to why you said curious, actually.
Well, curiosity and sort of learning are two different things. Okay. Learning is trying to figure out what there is. Curiosity is to understand why it's there. I had this discussion with Eldon from the University of Guyana, where we were talking about students and what is being used. And I think you met Eldon in Jamaica, if I'm not mistaken, right? To be able to use Python to write some quick machine learning algorithms and create something differentiating is one thing. And by the way, that will create incremental value. But to be able to look at Python and go, why does this Python behave this way? What came before it? Who was the person that wrote a compiler that created a whole new language called Python? Wait a second. This is all kind of assembly language behind this. I can translate this to C++ or to Rust. Let me think about what library is appropriate for the workload that I am using based on the fundamental libraries that the machines are shipped with or that are embedded in the chips. And now you start to look at the computing stack completely differently, and you go, Python may not be the most efficient language to write this model in. That's curiosity. That's the why. That's asking what's behind the magic. That's understanding how to go upstream to figure out what was done there to then compete with that information downstream. Right? So I think this kind of superficial learning of technology is one aspect of progress, but the curiosity to ask why, where did it come from? How does it work? Why does it happen like this? And what's probably going to happen next? That's what I mean by being insanely curious.
Great. What anchors you? So you spoke about being anchored in your roots so that you can weather the storm. And I think especially in the US, while it is the land of opportunity, it is the land of rejection as well, I think, in many forms. So what is it that keeps you anchored to and connected to that source of ambition?
Well, look, I think as an immigrant to the U.S., at least for me, um, your presence on the land is very purposeful, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
if you're born in the U.S., you just happen to be born here, and there are markets and capitalism, and that's where you were born. I was born in Guyana, in Blairmont, in Mobeus, right? And my mom and my grandparents and my uncles and aunts and my dad, they intentionally wanted a better life for my brother and I. There was a decade of paperwork being filled to apply for a visa and go through the various interviews and the scanning and the biographics. There was money that had to be saved to pay for the airline ticket. There was money that had to be saved to be put in a bank in the US to prove that we wouldn't be burdens when we came to the country. And so when you land here as an immigrant, you arrive with a deep sense of purpose, which is not, oh, I've arrived, story's over, let's party. It's no, I've arrived, the work just started,
Hmm.
right? We came here with a purpose. That purpose was to create a better life for ourselves that our parents would have been able to afford us in a different country, under a different rule of law, under a different cultural context. So I'm sort of deeply rooted in that embedding that in America there's an up,
Yes.
right? and so and so it's very purposeful and very intentional. Now, after you make a couple of shades of degrees of progress, you can kind of ease off a little bit. I kind of have it instilled in me that just like my parents allowed me to kind of scale one class of society over my lifetime, right? So if I think about how I've performed in the U.S. and many immigrants how have performed in the U.S. versus to their original lands, you kind of scale one class of society, right,
Hmm.
compared to where
Hmm.
you would have been. I want to give my kids the same. I want to give my kids an opportunity to scale one class of society as well for better education, better experiences, a more fulfilling life. So it becomes innate in you, I think. Some people do it for the fame, some people do it for the fortune, some people just do it because they don't know another way. I'm in that third category.
Interesting. Oh, I like that. I like that one. That's very simple, very transparent. Versus, I think many different people have so many layers of, or they're trying to prove something to someone, etc., etc. And I think for you, it's cool to see. And one of the reasons why I've enjoyed doing some research on your career. So as I looked at your LinkedIn, you had held several VP and high leadership positions in top US financial institutions and a big healthcare company as well. What have you learned across those journeys? That's like the pinnacle to some degree of corporate America. Um, and you're a guy from Guyana. Tell me, walk us through that.
First of all, I'm not an N of one. There are many other people from the Caribbean that have achieved similar roles and higher.
Mm-hmm.
Jackie Wright is the CTO of McKinsey, right? And I
Ooh,
think
really?
she's of
Oh,
Jamaican.
oh,
Yeah,
vibes,
she's of
vibes.
Jamaican
Okay.
descent, right? Um, so for me, what I wanted to really understand in the corporate environment was how to make money. That was
Okay.
that was sort of what you were kind of challenged with, right? What I found was that there was a whole bunch of other things I needed to learn
Hmm.
way before I could learn how to make money. I'll give you an example. I used to, and I was in my late 20s, I think, late 20s, just coming up on 30. I used to work with a guy named Greg. And Greg was a managing director, and I was an up and coming director, about to make executive director sometime soon. And Greg and I are just out to lunch, and he mentioned to me that his father was an MD at Goldman Sachs. I was at UBS at the time. So this
Mm-hmm.
guy's dad was a managing director at Goldman Sachs while he was growing up. Okay.
Wow.
Now, compared to me, when I got to Prudential Securities at 2021, which is now Wells Fargo, I didn't even know that you could get a title. I didn't even understand the difference between VP, assistant VP, director, and managing director. And I was 21 years old, right?
Mm,
So there's a massive learning curve that I had to go through to understand all the dynamics of business before you could even learn how to make, cash flow and profits and
I see.
margins and all that type of stuff. So that's part of the journey, I think, that I would encourage others to kind of realize that you're going to have to go through that learning curve. It's not just a lift and shift, right? That's a part of the learning curve. The other thing is that you should definitely want to work across different segments of various industries. And here's what I mean by that. When I was on Wall Street, so I spent time at Prudential, which is Wells Fargo. I spent time at Lehman, which is Barclays. I had nothing to do with
Mm-hmm.
these companies being acquired. And then I spent time at UBS, right? If UBS had failed and Credit Suisse had acquired UBS, you could say it's me. I'm the fault. That's why everything happened, right? But UBS stands strong today and acquired Credit Suisse. So I spent about 10, 12 years in the financial services industry in what you call the buy side. And that means on the
Mm,
buy side of technology. So you're buying technology from other service providers. You're buying technology from Microsoft. You're buying technology from Salesforce. You're buying technology from Oracle, right? I made a deliberate career choice to change industries and change sides. So I
mm,
left the financial services industry. I went over into healthcare, in pharmaceuticals specifically. So another regulated industry, but completely different. Pharmaceutical, by the way, when I got to the pharmaceutical industry, I couldn't spell pharmaceuticals properly because it's a complicated word to spell. Like the autocorrect would get me every time, right? And I went on the sell side of technology. So at IQVIA, we were service providers. We serviced Pfizer and all the rest of other pharmaceutical companies with technology, with data, and with services. So I got to learn how to sell, how to package, how to shape demand, how to use thought leadership to be able to condition markets, right? So my advice here is to make sure that you don't work in the same industry, in the same segment for your entire 30, 40-year career. In
mm.
order to make some of these leaps and bounds, you've got to be able to shift around. You have to be able to see capitalism like how Neo sees the Matrix, right? You've got to be able to see it from all perspectives. You have to get to a type of experience set where when you land in an organization, regardless of the geography, the industry, or the segment of that industry, you can kind of go, okay, that's HR, that's compliance, that's legal, that's analytics, that's corporate, that's M&A, that's venture. Oh, I can put all the pieces together pretty quickly. And that requires that you intentionally put yourself in a situation where you're getting those experiences that start to fill in that 360-degree view. That's what I'm doing in entrepreneurship now. I've taken all of that experience, and now in entrepreneurship, you're doing that in a microcosm in 4K,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I'm starting to see it from completely different angles now. And that's to me, that is the only thing that I would say I did intentionally to be able to achieve some of the things that I've achieved in my career. Everything else comes from a little bit of luck, having a good network, working hard, just happening to be in the right elevator at the right time, talking to the right senior person. I mean, one of my biggest promotions came from just being in the right elevator at the right time.
Really interesting.
Yep.
I We have a thesis on the show that people from the Caribbean inherently have an advantage in corporate America to some degree because we've grown up in these extremely diverse environments. We went to school with all different races, religions. So when we meet people, is a vibe. It's just people. We don't see differences. How has your Caribbean heritage contributed to success in your career?
Well, I think first of all, one of the things that differentiates the Caribbean immigrant from other immigrants across the world is that most of us are natively English spoken. So that's a big advantage. Imagine coming to the country, having to learn a new legal system, a new economic system, a new social and cultural system, and a new language at the same time.
Okay.
You would
Yes.
not believe how big of a leg up we from the Caribbean have just because we speak English. So that's to me one of the most differentiating contributions that my heritage adds here. Um, Second is the diversity. You're right. We eat each other's food. We dance each other's music. We
We date
don't.
each other.
Right. I think it's unfair to say that we don't see color. We actually see color. We see the
Hmm.
difference. We understand it. A lot of people go, "Oh, I don't see color." Well, then you're blind, right?
Okay. Okay.
We see color. Like I know when I connect with a Jamaican, I know how to connect with them, right? My wife laughs at me all the time. Whenever I land in Jamaica, suddenly I speak fluent Jamaican, right? Because I know, or if I connect with a Trini, I know how to connect with a Trini. And so when I meet, someone from the Midwest of the US, I know how to connect with them. When I meet someone from Germany versus someone from Norway, I know that there's a different way to connect with people. We've learned this skill of having this heterogeneous set of filters that we can use to engage with diverse subjects. And I think that's another superpower. Whereas, if you grow up in certain aspects of the US, for example, you don't have such a wide filter, a wide collection of filters to be able to engage with others. So that's I think is the second. And then third really is just work ethic. Again, it goes back to that purposeful placement onto the country, right? I would argue that many other immigrants have that same one, but I think the two things that we have that differentiate us is English, which we take for granted. Okay.
Yeah.
And then that sort of broad swath of filters to be able to really connect deeply with people of all shapes, sizes, and complexion.
Hmm. I didn't think about the language thing. You're perfectly accurate in that statement. I was just like, English, it didn't necessarily make sense. But now that I think actually quite deeply about it, it would be incredibly difficult to learn another language because I don't know another language, which inherently make, makes sense as to why I don't do that.
No, it's
Let,
it's it's not that bad for people who come from languages that are based in Latin. So like Spanish, okay, you
mm,
could learn English. French, maybe try going from Mandarin to English.
yeah, and those
Yeah.
folks are sharp. Um,
Yeah.
let's talk computer science. So you did your bachelor's in computer science, you did your MBA, and then you started doing your PhD, and you did the ABD route. Um, one,
Yep.
why did you do an MBA? Because I asked that question specifically because I think as a technical person, I find myself in that position like, okay, should you do it? Should you not do it? I've done all the schooling just like yourself, and I think I'm sick of school to some degree. But what's your thoughts on the MBA and how has that contributed to your career?
I think the the value of an MBA is not as high as it was when I did an MBA.
Mm,
Much like the value of a degree is getting less and less. So
okay.
times are different. You see now reputable Fortune 20 companies are hiring people without a degree, right? Um, I grew up in a time where you better have that degree or you're not
Mm-hmm.
going anywhere. And so the MBA for me was probably 49% ceremonial stamp of approval, 51% I actually needed to learn something new.
Makes sense.
Um, I do believe that an MBA adds a tremendous amount of value because it gives you some basic economic hygiene. It gives you some basic
Hmm.
managerial hygiene. It gives you some basic leadership hygiene. And more importantly, it puts a vocabulary that you may think you're familiar with into 4K. Okay. So you might hear things like margins, you may hear things like P&L, you may hear things like profitability, you may hear things as like, currency conversion or interest rates or dividends or earnings per share or market caps. And while you're familiar with the language, you don't absolutely understand it in 4K.
Hmm.
Okay. And what the MBA did for me was it allowed me to both speak and comprehend financial vocabulary and business vocabulary in 4K. That's where it added, where I can actually generate the thoughts and generate the sentences and generate the sentiment as opposed to just consuming it and understanding it. It's not like I didn't understand anything that I learned in my MBA, but I couldn't be the source of the information. And so that's the crossover that I benefited from an MBA.
Great. And what's your advice? What's your thoughts on PhD? There's a lot of different people that have thoughts about that as they think about their career. And
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know what I was thinking with my PhD, to be honest. So it was very, very frustrating. The PhD process is very
Mm-hmm.
frustrating because you're not supposed to think. Don't think. Just validate everybody else's theory and barely add a margin of insight on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone
Mm-hmm.
like me, that's suffocating. You're literally drowning me in a pool if that's the academic construct that you put me in. Because I want to
Mm-hmm.
create, I want to think, I want to extrapolate, I want to see different vantage points. I want to stretch out 100,000 years and go, what is this going to look like then? Right. And I'm not so inclined to be rooted in only what was proved by research and evidence.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, and I come from a genre of arguers that would say, sure, but at one point we thought the world was flat, and here we are wrong. So everything that we believe today could very well be wrong a couple of 100 years from now, right?
Yes.
So that was not conducive for me with the PhD. And then I couldn't get the dissertation out. So my dissertation was around attention span. So I
Okay.
did some research that looked at generation after generation how our attention span was shortening and the impact of the shortening of that attention span. And I had some great data, some great research, and I had what I thought were amazing theories that would come together. But in the dissertation process, you're not supposed to generate anything new. You're not supposed to be too smart. You're not supposed to be
Mm-hmm.
too creative. And I literally had one of my advisors say to me, you need to dumb this paper down and
Wow.
save all of that for the book that you're going to publish
Hmm.
afterwards. And I just looked at it and said, okay, man, I'm kind of done now. This has been enough for me. So pro MBA, but question mark around PhD. For me personally, I felt like it was probably not the best spend of my time and resources.
Yes.
But you know, uh, anti-fragile, man.
It's good perspective, and I think at least the PhD process makes you very determined. I think they intentionally make it quite suffocating to some degree to make sure that you can push through it. But there's, like you're saying, there is that hard limit of what you can really do in that a very defined domain. This is good.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, let's shift to as we shift to closing. Let's shift to advice. Okay, how do you stay on top of your personal and professional game? What's your optimization techniques?
First of all, network
Mm,
matters.
mm,
Um, I try to cultivate, curate, and fertilize a good professional network um, across different industries, thought leaders, practitioners. You'd be surprised how much inspiration you can get over lunch by talking to someone who works in a different industry that doesn't work in the segment of that industry that you work in.
I see.
And so I found the network to be probably, I'd say, my number one ingredient, so to speak. Two is to be super intentional. Right. Most people stay too long past where they should have stayed in a particular role. And most people quit just before they were ready to succeed. You have to be very intentional about timing. I've been lucky so far to be able to execute the path of intentionality in my career. Not everybody has that luxury. Sometimes things change, life changes, and it forces you to make career choices. But I think having an intentional design of what you're going to do, how do you charter your career to where you want it to be? Right? I definitely did not want to be a one industry type professional. I wanted to be across industries. It was very important for me to understand the rest of the world and to get a broader sense as to what's going on there. So number one is your network. Number two is that intentionality on the timing. And then I think the third really is to recognize that your career is something where you have to decide whether you are going to work because you can push the boundaries or you're going to work because you need a salary.
Ooh.
And these are two very different mindsets. The first book I wrote was called Corporate Awesome Sauce. And the thesis of the book was like these 10 hacks of how to change the corporate ladder. And the first one was try to get fired once a month.
Okay.
And I'd found in a particular job that I had, because I didn't really need the job at the time, I found that the more I tried to get fired, the more I got promoted. Because the more I was willing to take risk, the more I was willing to speak up, the more I was willing to point things out that may not be obvious to everyone else, the more I got promoted. And in general, you kind of think that, oh, that's going to get me fired. If I do that, that's going to get me fired. It's probably going to get me fired. If you look around with, sort of fearful eyes, anything you do can get you fired. And I kind of made a decision intentionally in my career that I would never, ever fear being fired. And that allows you to take on work in a completely different context, right? You are there as a courage agent. You are there as a change agent. And that creates a whole different career arc, I think. And that has been something that I've been lucky to kind of discover and cultivate through various methods of osmosis or self-discovery. But I go into every job knowing that my purpose there is to serve the organization regardless of whether it impacts my employability or not. And once you take on that stewardship of shareholder value and sort of corporate performance, it kind of shapes the complexion differently. You're either there to change the organization or you're there to collect the check.
Ooh, that's deep, man. I'm taking the notes, and one thing I've learned in doing these interviews is that people from the Caribbean population are very powerful, and what I mean by that is, I think we've absorbed a lot of the knowledge of the world, and by our own presence in a lot of these large institutions, we showcase sort of what we can do. So I really appreciate you sharing those thoughts. I have two quick questions to some degree. 3 books you recommend folks reading? I'm going to read your corporate book because now I'm going to get fired.
So classic to me is How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Okay.
Dale Carnegie. So that would be number one. Number two would be a book called Borrowing Brilliance. It's written by a guy named David Cord Murray. This is the guy who came up with the idea for AOL to ship the CDs with the code already on it. Yeah, Borrowing Brilliance. And he's all about, the book is all about the fact that you really don't invent anything new. You're borrowing different ideas from different places and reconstructing it. And then third, let me see, Sapiens.
Really?
Sapiens.
Okay, so I haven't read it. But okay,
Yuval
that's
Noah
good.
Harari. Sapiens will definitely put the world into historical context for you. You're going to see world from
Mm,
what I call the lens of big history. Yeah, that would
beautiful.
be my three.
All right, last question. What is one piece of advice you have for a high schooler, a college student, and a professional?
Well, first of all, they should hang out with each other because there's a lot to learn from the various
Okay,
decades.
cool, cool.
um, so, as a high schooler, I think enjoy it. Believe me,
Hmm.
you miss it when you get older. There are certain aspects of youth. I felt like in high school, I was so determined and motivated to get older that I kind of
Yes.
missed the opportunity to really enjoy adolescence and early adolescence. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying be reckless. I'm not saying don't be intentional, but I'm saying just it's the most beautiful time of life. And I think that's high school. For college, I would say, you know, look outside more. What you're learning is a microscopic piece of what you're actually going to need for work. Look
Hmm.
outside more, look for more influence, look for more exposure, look for more engagement, way beyond internships. I think that would be my advice there. And then for professionals, be more intentional about your career. It's not just an accidental set of jobs that are strung together into a career. You can be very intentional about how you architect it.
Fantastic. Hey man, I have thoroughly enjoyed this interview. I have a lot of deep thinking and re-optimizing on my own career, and I love to learn from folks who've traveled the journey before me, and I truly appreciate your time.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me. Love to come back at any point and get into some of more of the stuff. And for any audience member who's trying to find me, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I respond to just about most messages that come through LinkedIn. So
Great.
thanks
I'll make
again.
sure and put everything in the show notes. Take care. Later.
All right, thanks. Bye bye.